Hey guys, how's it going? Value Venture Investing here today. So today we're going to be talking about Virgin Galactic, specifically their Q2 2023 earnings. This quarter was the first quarter we saw almost $2 million of revenue. If you've been following my videos for a while, we've been actually waiting for some of this revenue to show up. So basically what we're going to do in this video is I'm going to quickly go through their financials. We're going to go through their earnings presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight in terms of what I heard on the conference call, including something that's really important, I think. And then we're going to quickly go through their financials. So take a look at their stock right now. As of today, down about 4-ish% as of recording this. I think that quite a bit of this news may be baked in a little bit, but there's a couple little surprises here as well. So if you haven't been paying attention a lot lately, what's going on, here's a little update on some of the recent updates that are very important lately. On July 13th, 2023 this year, the company announced a planned launch date of August 10th for Galactic 2. So that remains to be seen. On June 29th, the company completed the commercial space flight Galactic 1. So this carried 13 research payloads, three crew members from the Italian Air Force and the National Research Council of Italy. So we're going to get a little bit more into that on this video on the presentation. On May 25th, 2023, the company completed Unity 25 mission to space. It carried 4 Virgin Galactic mission specialists to evaluate the end-to-end astronaut training and space flight experience prior to commencing commercial operations. And on June 22nd, so not too long ago here now, the company actually diluted a bit more again here. They did an at-the-market offering program to sell up to $400 million of the company stock. So they generated $77 million in proceeds, and they issued 17 million shares during this time. So hopefully going forward here, we're just going to be hearing a lot more about not so many tests. We're going to actually hear about flights, but we're going to get into that. Top line items here. So what I did is Q3 2022, Q4, Q1 of this year, and Q2. So you can kind of see sequentially how this has increased. Of course, we are $1.871 million. We're going to get into where that came from. So we've finally seen that significant increase, 392,000 here, 869, 767. Net income losses remain relatively consistent. We had a loss of $134.36 million this quarter. Pretty in line. It's dropped a little bit. Cash, of course, we did dilute. We got 979 million. We were at $1 billion Q3 last year, but it seems like they like to keep this $870 to $1 billion in cash reserves, and hopefully they won't be doing any more diluting going forward. So we're going to get into this after we go through the presentation, because I think it'll make a little bit more sense. So let's do that right now. So as usual, we have the agenda here. They're going to talk about the commercial spaceline operations, the future fleet development, and then the financial overview, but we're going to do that ourselves. So here, first of all, we talked about on May 25th here, Unity 25. So this was to, have a final assessment of the ground-based training, assessment of the astronaut experience, and then we shoot ahead here to June 29th, where we actually have Galactic 1, which is their first commercial space mission. So there's 3 crew members from the Italian Air Force, as I mentioned before, and the National Research Council of Italy. We got some photos here. They successfully executed 13 research payloads. So what this means is they did actually research experiments, and this is where, of course, probably the majority of this revenue that we saw came from this quarter, as these research flights actually kind of generated a bit more money than the customer experience, but we'll get into that as well. Then on this next slide here, they went a little bit more into, what this research is. So they said extended time in microgravity, human tendered research in space, frequent access with favorable cost comparisons. So here, they talked about the modularity of the cabin, and so the different types of research that can be done. And they talked about how expensive it can actually be to do this microgravity research on the International Space Station. So they're positioning the business a little bit more towards this research as well. Of course, you don't have as much time in microgravity, but it's a lot cheaper and a lot quicker than actually trying to get out to the International Space Station. So that could be a huge driving factor going forward. Then we're going into the future, Galactic 2. So the flight window opens on August 10th. So this is going to be the first private astronaut mission. Now, I was a little bit disappointed with this one here. So they're saying the first astronauts are from Antigua, tell me if I'm telling that wrong, The first mother-daughter duo to go to space, the second youngest person to go to space, second person diagnosed with Parkinson's to go to space. Okay, good for them, but I'm not too sure how much value that adds right now. And as you can notice here, it looks like there's only 3 astronauts. We've got the commander down below, the pilot, and the chief astronaut instructor. We're going to get into this a little bit more in the future here, in this video that is. This is going to be live stream, so you can watch. It might be good to watch. And they also mentioned later on the call that this is the first of the 800 customers that are on their list. So that's going to be a little important when we talk about money here a little bit going forward as well. Here, this next slide, they didn't talk about too much. They basically talked about how they want a monthly cadence, recurring space flights of VSS Unity, talked about their training in the Spaceport America. The next slide here, the Delta. We always talk about the Delta class spaceship because this is the one that's going to, presumably generate the most revenue. So in 2023, this year, they're going to be focusing on completing designs. 2024, they're going to be completing assembly and equipment installation designs. And they're going to be initiating the assembly phase. So that's next year. 2025, they're going to be testing. And then 2026, they say they're still on flight for commercial service. So that's a little bit far out. In terms of the quarterly results, we kind of went into this. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but we'll quickly go through it here. Revenue of $2 million. It wasn't quite $2 million compared to $0.4 million in the prior year. They're saying that this is primarily driven to commercial spaceflight and future astronaut membership fees. Operating expenses of $141 million compared to $110 million the prior year. This is primarily due to R&D expenses and the development of the future fleet. Net loss of $134 million versus $111 million in the prior year, and this was of course higher to primarily to higher R&D expenses, which is to be expected. Earnings before income tax, dividends, and amortization, the loss of $116 million compared to $93 million in the prior year. And free cash flow was a loss of $135 million compared to $91 million in the prior year. Now, this was in line with guidance, so that's at least good to see. And as mentioned here, they raised $241 million in stock proceeds as they issued 55 million shares. And another thing that's kind of important here that they talked about that you guys should be aware of, going forward, next quarter on, customer experience, which I talked about before, and I didn't know exactly what was entailed there. That line item will be renamed Spaceline Operations. Now, this is going to include components of Spaceline Technical Operations and Spaceline's missions and safety, which were initially reported in R&D or selling general administrative expenses. So look out for that going forward. Of course, we talk about the cash equivalents here. This is kind of self-explanatory, about $874 million last quarter and about $980 million this quarter. Now, this is the important thing. We're going to talk about this a little bit more on the board here, but the financial outlook, this is what's moving the stock here. So the revenue guidance for Q3 and Q4 2023 is approximately $1 million. And I believe that's for each quarter. They expect 2 commercial space flights in the third quarter and 3 in the fourth quarter. So that's 5 in total in the next 2 quarters. They expect revenue to be $1 million in each of these quarters. Now, keep in mind, last quarter, they said about $2.7 million they'd be generating per space flight. But of course, keep in mind, that's for the Delta class. So that might have been confused by a lot of people before. This is approximately $400,000 if you do the math. We don't know how it's split between each one of these space flights, but this is approximately $400,000. Q3 and Q4 cash flow guidance expected to be around the range of $120 to $130 million. So it looks like we've reached the top end, hopefully there, of cash for burn. Now, before we get into the financials, we're going to quickly go through a couple things that were on the conference call. There was not very much. Again, as we know, commercial service is expected monthly, which is good, starting in August. But the concern is how much are they actually going to be generating? So there was a question from an analyst regarding how we had $2 million this quarter, right? Well, it wasn't even $2 million, but close. Yet in the next 5 flights, we're only expecting $2 million for 5 flights. And so you do the math, it's about $400K per flight. We don't know how this is, how much revenue per flight rather. So the answer was depending on the mix. So they gave a little bit more insight onto the mix. So they're saying some of these early prices, and I don't know how many early, these go back quite far, some before they even had their IPO, their initial public offering, were between $200,000 and $250,000 per seat. So I'm assuming that they are using these ones first. They expect going forward that these prices are going to remain at $400,000, roughly around there, or $450,000, somewhere around there. And in the near term, they're expecting about $600K $600,000 per flight. 2024, about $800,000 per flight. And of course, one of these reasons being that they have the astronaut trainers on board. And if you go back in this video right here, it showed there's only 3. There was like an astronaut trainer, there was a commander, right? So it makes sense the way you're looking at it, but if you're only pulling about 400,000, and we know that, actually, I don't think I wrote in here as well. I think I missed this. Research, maybe I didn't hear. Research, they're about $600,000 they're making for research flights versus actual seats for future astronauts. So if you put in that mix in there, how much is research? How much is customer passengers? It seems pretty obvious to me that they're going to have very similar going forward, where they're going to have some of these earlier customers and maybe 3 people that are not paid, because they do talk about being safer. Like they're going to be looking at having astronaut trainers and such as well. But I'm not too sure if this is something that was known before. We kind of expected that maybe they'd be generating, I don't know, 400 or whatever the pre-sale prices were, and they were going to be 5, maybe even 6 per flight. But if the next 2 quarters, we're only going to be having about $2 million, that's showing that this is taking a lot longer to get going. And even the math laid out this way, it doesn't quite add up. So I wonder if they're going to break down who's going to be on the next flights. As more customers come in, they said it's, there's a privacy concern. They're obviously going to be live streaming when paying customers are going. But so that's very disappointing. And that's something that could definitely affect the value of the stock. When you have a market cap of over $1 billion and you're only generating, let's say, a couple $1 million a year, and we don't know how much that revenue is going to increase until we get the Delta class spacecraft, which is in 2026, and that's about $2.7 million per flight. That really brings into question the valuation, and maybe the valuation is actually pretty fair right now. Of course, I own shares, so I'm just holding on to them, but I would love to know what you guys think about that. Because I think that was the biggest disappointment coming out of this, and why the stock was actually down today, and aftermarket wise down quite a bit. So we'll see going forward how much they actually generate, but it seems like it's going to be a lot less than what we expected. So that's not great news in my opinion, but love to know what you guys think. So put a comment down below about that. So let's quickly go through their financials right now. Taking a look at the income statement here again, we have this on the board, $1.817 million versus $357,000 a year ago. Operating expenses, you can see customer experience went up, research and development went up. Of course, that's quite to be expected, and SG&A also went up quite a bit. So we had an operating loss of $139.5 million versus $109.7 million. So that increased relatively significantly, but that's to be expected as well. So that brought us down to a net loss of $134.36 million versus $110 million a year ago. And of course, we have foreign currency adjustments, unrealized gains on marketable securities, but we won't include that right now. So the operating net loss is a little bit more indicative of what's going on. In terms of the balance sheet, again, we added these numbers up. If you're wondering how they're coming up with these cash amounts, cash equivalents, restricted cash included in there as well, marketable security short term, and they don't have any marketable securities long term. So that's where they get that roughly $980 million in cash. One thing as well here under liabilities is that customer deposits have dropped slightly, 100 million versus 102-ish million. Now they talked about the Titan sub, and they're saying that they didn't see any change there whatsoever, because that was a question that some people were kind of thinking, do we see any reservations drop off? But this seems kind of typical for the amount that they have. In terms of cash flows, not too much here as well. Of course, purchases of marketable securities, they purchased quite a significant amount, $409 million. They also had a significant amount of proceeds from the maturities of $471 million. So they actually had a cash inflow this quarter of $48.7 million. Again, here's the proceeds from the issuance of common stock, $273 million. You can see it on the balance sheet there. So going forward, I think we're going to be a little bit of range bound in this price point until we see some positive momentum in terms of generating more revenue. This might have been known already. Maybe I wasn't quite aware. I expected it to be more. So again, would love to know what you guys think. So that's going to be it for today, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.